So I'm going to try in 25 minutes to give you a brief overview of what this project is about. And so we'll start with what is Sowams. Most of you probably know that you're sitting in Sowams. It's by definition the southern area, and we'll talk about that. It's the home of Osamequin, the Massasoit of the Pokanoket tribe, who was here long before any Europeans got here. The Pokanoket tribe was. Osamequin was born in about 1598 or so, lived till 1661. And if you read Virginia Baker, you know that Sowams is right here in Warren. All you have to do is go look at the town hall and you'll see Sowams right there. If you live in Barrington and read Tom Bicknell, you'll see that Sowams is over there. So it depends on who you want to read and who you want to believe. But really what we're talking about is that whole region. It's on that map there, but essentially from the Taunton River up to the Providence and what was once called the Sowams Bay. Okay. Bicknell locates Sowams over here in Barrington, but many people argue that it was in Warren. It really doesn't matter, folks, because the Pokanoket tribe didn't stay in one place. It's not like they had a permanent village. They moved about with the seasons and occupied all kinds of places, all the way up to Mount Wachusett. In fact, if you look at the map of the Pokanoket tribal area, you will see that it extends north to the Massachusetts tribal area, all the way down to Martha's Vineyard and well into Providence. Okay, so it was a large territory that Massasoit was responsible for, I guess is the best way to say it. He didn't dictate that, but he convened council members and representatives from 31 tribes throughout this area. But Sowams itself is really this particular area, the southern area of their territory. And that was especially important and significant. Miles Standish called it the flower, and he spelled it F-L-O-U-R, of the patent. Okay, but he meant that it was a gorgeous place. You imagine you come from England and you're looking for land for your cattle and your pigs and a place to grow things, and you come upon land that's already been cleared, some of it's been planted, okay, and this enormous access to water, both fresh and salt water. Fresh water with springs, as well as all the rivers that we have running through here, everything from the Palmer River, the Runnins River, all these rivers coming into saltwater. The point was that they recognized this area as significant all by itself. Okay? Today, however, look at what we've done. We've recognized how wonderful this area is, and we do what we do, which is we build buildings and roads and occupy the area. Okay, so in that respect, we're still recognizing it as a beautiful area. But we've put up all our European structures and in a lot of ways hidden Sowams from the people who live here. Back in 1600 and for 8,000 to 12,000 years before, long before the pyramids were built in Egypt, okay, long before there was really any, quote, Western civilization, people were living all over this area. Now, till about 1100 or so, people were pretty much nomadic. They were hunter-gatherers, went from place to place, depending on the season, and hunted, fished, and traveled about and didn't have any permanent locations. But the archaeological record shows that corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were imported somewhere along that line from other parts of the country. So there began about 1500 to be real establishments, in the sense that Sowams or other villages weren't permanent in the sense that people lived here year-round, but they would come back to familiar places over and over again. And they were able to stay for longer periods of time because they didn't have to move to hunt and fish. So by creating areas where they could spend more time, they created more culture, and in that respect developed money, like wampum, ways of exchange. And when the Europeans arrived, they began to do a significant amount of trading, both for the European goods, anything made out of metal, which they did not have, other than a little copper from Wisconsin, to trade for furs. And that was, when we understand the survival of the pilgrims in Plymouth, we rarely think about trading for furs as their main economic base. But that turned out to be the case. They didn't plan on that, but they found out later, particularly with the Dutch, that they could greatly amplify their earnings by trading with the Native Americans for their furs. So this culture began to transform with contact with the Europeans. And the European culture began to transform with contact with the Native Americans. It was a very interesting 50-year period of exchange that took place between 1621 and the outbreak of the King Philip War. 10,000 people arrived from Europe, okay? Population, European population was over 50,000 by 1675. Okay? There's enormous numbers of people coming here. At the same time, the indigenous population began to decline, principally because of outbreaks of illness, infectious diseases, smallpox. We're not really sure what other diseases they had, but let's put it this way. If you have lived in Europe for generations, you've developed all kinds of immunity to these diseases. The people who didn't have immunity died. The people who did survived. And by the time traders were coming here in the 1500s, they were immune to those diseases, but at the same time carried those diseases. So without anybody having any good understanding of what infectious illnesses were all about, although you have to say they had some concept that contact seemed to make this happen. They didn't know why, but enormous numbers of the people who had lived here for those 8,000 to 12,000 years began to die. So many that by the time the pilgrims came to Plymouth, 90% of the native population had died. So many so that Patuxet, which is the village that became the pilgrim village in Plymouth, that no one was left. There were simply human bones left on the ground because there was no one alive to bury the dead. It was that bad. Of course, the Europeans read that as a sign from God that this land was theirs for the taking. And that's exactly what they did. However, if you read any of the accounts of what happened in Plymouth, half the 102 people there perished over that first 5 or 6 months. That winter was terrible. And it were it not for the intervention of Massasoit and his people that following spring, probably the rest of them would have died. The whole thing would have failed. If they were able to get back on the ship and go back to Europe, that would have been the end of it, okay? And probably the Mass Bay colony wouldn't have happened either, okay? So a lot of that history really depended on the relationship between the native population and the people from Europe who came to colonize. There was a treaty in 1621, signed on board the Mayflower, and I won't go over all the details of that, but basically it said, we'll protect you if you protect us, okay? And that was a reciprocal agreement. The first treaty of that sort anywhere in the world between an indigenous population and a colonizing population. And it really set the tone for the next 50 years during Massasoit's life for a positive relationship between those two people because they were dependent on one another. Well, that dependency ceased really over time. It wasn't a matter of one or two incidents, but an accumulation of incidents that occurred principally in the late 1650s on into 1675, when the population of colonists was increasing tremendously, and you saw people coming in with their cattle and their pigs and establishing farms, and though they, quote, purchased the land, to the Native Americans, they purchased the ability to hunt and fish on those lands. But in time, there were conflicts over and over and over again between the colonists and the indigenous population here. The indigenous population was waning. The people were still dying of sickness and illnesses. They were under stress from this whole invasion that was coming from Europe. And the Europeans were getting bolder and bolder about their ownership of the land and their rule over the people who had lived here. So we went from a mutual balance between the two to a really skewed imbalance, where the English population was violating some of their own rules and regulations vis-a-vis the indigenous population. And as you can imagine, as you're watching your own people dying year after year, and your territory being occupied by strangers from some far-off land, the feeling began to emerge, particularly in the 1670s, that something had to be done. And though Philip, who was Osamequin's second son, his first son, Alexander, died mysteriously, and there was a lot of suspicion that it had to do with poisoning by the Europeans. Philip met a comet who took the name King Philip because that's who you call a ruler in England. You call him a king. So he became King Philip, and he began to talk about the possibility that things needed to change, but didn't advocate for war that we know of. It was his own warriors who rose up, and not far from here, probably over on Child Street, not far from the Kickamuit River. There was a farm there, and John Salisbury's son encountered some Native Americans, ended up firing a rifle at one of them, and you can read the rest of the story. I'm not going to go into the whole King Philip War, but it began right here in Warren. Okay? That war lasted a little over a year. It ended in the killing of King Philip in Bristol, not far from one of his home territories, the Mount Hope, okay? And the King Philip chair is still there. The miry swamp where he was shot is still there. It's on Mount Hope farmland. You can't get to it now without permission, but it's still there. And that war ended within a month after the killing of Anawan, who was killed or encountered by Benjamin Church. You know, Church Manor down here in Bristol. Okay. You can read a lot about Church and how he treated the Native Americans, how he won that war, principally by adopting their style of warfare, which was a guerrilla style, because the English style of marching down the road and, you know, shooting was not working. So the war ended, but that didn't end what happened to the Native American people. And in fact, there became a whole way of dealing with people at that time that was the model for how we were going to deal with Native Americans for the next 200 years, which was capture, conversion, massacre, enslavement, silencing, and eradication. And I could spend a lot of time, as Pat knows, about any one of these topics, but basically, before the Europeans even got here, and you'll see this in the Plymouth 400 celebration. Thankfully, they have picked up on that, and they talk about capture of 20 Native American warriors in 1617, I believe, where they simply took them back to Europe, and one of them came back to Squatamon, who became an interpreter for the Pilgrims at that point. But that begins to show you kind of what the attitudes were, that you could simply capture people and take them away. Conversion. There was a great deal of effort to convert Native Americans starting at about 1650 to Christianity. The idea being that now we have many more English people here, smaller numbers of Native Americans. Let's make sure that Native Americans act, dress, and believe just like we do. So there were some 14 communities that were established all over principally Massachusetts in an attempt to, this is John Eliot preaching to the Native Americans, to convert them. But if you understand what was going on, it was really a matter of eradicating their culture, okay, not just conversion for religious purposes. One of the most significant events prior to the war, in fact in 1637, just a year after Roger Williams landed where Providence is now, there was a massacre with the Pequots, where hundreds of men, women, and children were slaughtered and burned during a war. That had never happened before. Native Americans had never done that to the English. But once the English did that to them, they saw that as a legitimate way of responding. And then when that same action was repeated just after the start of the King Philip War in December of 1675, with another massacre, the Great Swamp Massacre. You can go down to Narragansett and see the location for that. Another 400 men, women, and children were burned alive. Okay, imagine if this was in the news today. Okay, in a village that was controlled by the Narragansetts at that point in time. When you look at the fact that Native Americans were burning towns, 75% of the towns in Massachusetts during the King Philip War were burned to the ground. Many colonists died, about 1,000, in an effort on the part of the Native Americans to get the English to simply go back to where they came from, okay? And if you look at the sweep of the war, it looks like this action where they start in the West and simply move forward with the idea like, you don't like this, go back, okay? Now maybe that was naive, but it was an act of desperation, I think, on their part. And they were acting in the same ways that the colonists acted toward them. No war can be justified, but if you understand the dynamic that was taking place, it makes a lot more sense. After that war, Native Americans were enslaved in all kinds of ways, and I'm reading my Kindred Brethren right now, which goes into a lot of detail about the different kinds of enslavement, and it wasn't uniform. There are many ways that people were enslaved. And then, since that time, silencing and eradication. I asked the question to the Pokanoket tribe members that I've been meeting with, what happened to the Pokanokets? Where are they? There are 250 of them that still live in this region today, but you will not hear a word from them. They have no land, they have no voice, and other than the little uprising you saw at Brown University at Mount Hope last fall, they really are not to be heard from. And this is a whole history of how we have erased Native Americans from the landscape. Not just here, but then over and over and over again, all the way with Manifest Destiny to the West Coast. I won't spend any more time on that. There's a lot more that can be said. So the colonial settlements that expanded, and if you go on the web page for Sowams Heritage Area, you'll find over 50 different locations that we've discovered so far that still exist, that have a connection to time before 1700. We've all seen the changes in the land. This is a Photoshop look at what was Brooks Pasture, where we're sitting right now in Warren, and now modern day Warren, Tyler Point, which we think may have been where Osamequin met the Dutch traders, and now it's the Barrington Yacht Club and the Stanley Boatyard, right? How do we uncover 400 years? Well, that's what this whole project is about, is to help people who live here, first of all, to understand what happened here, who used to be here, and then to invite people from outside the region and around the world to come and learn something about this transition that took place in the 1600s. On the website are some short videos. We hope to do presentations to local groups and schools. We hope to have signage at various locations. How many people have been to the Osamequin Monument in Burrs Hill? Okay, good. I'm glad. The rest of you need to find that in Burrs Hill. That's the reburial of a Native American gravesite that was dug up by my wife's predecessor, Charles Carr, in 1914. He thought he was doing a good job because the people were just stealing bones out of the ground, and he thought, well, let's put them in the library and in a museum. But today we recognize that not necessarily a good thing, and the Mashpee tribe came and reinterred over 600 items into a crypt there, and that's what the Osamequin marker is. It includes, we believe, Osamequin's gravesite remains, but we shouldn't be digging up those gravesites any more than you want your relatives' gravesites to be dug up and put in museums, okay? We hope to have some newspaper and television coverage, some endorsements from the various groups around here. We have a grant application in to the Rhode Island Council for Humanities. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, and if we receive that, that'll enable us to do a launch event in September to tell people in all 13 communities what this is all about and get some more publicity for it. This could, over time, lead to the establishment of a National Historic Corridor similar to the Blackstone Corridor, okay? And it's an opportunity to give recognition to what's taken place here and invite people to learn more about it. There are lots of implications for history and heritage development. This, by the way, is where Roger Williams first spent his winter, just over the Swansea line off of Chase Farm, if you're familiar with that, in North Warren there. And we hope to have some site visits there, but you can explore all these different locations and learn more about what's right in our backyard. The conservation efforts, making sure that what land we have preserved, we continue to preserve, so that people can have some idea of what Sowams was like 400 years ago. Certainly recreation. I love the fact that the bike path goes right through this area, and we hope to have more interpretive signage on that, but lots of wildlife and areas that people can visit and enjoy, and to do some education. It includes Hunts Mills, where we'll probably be headquartered in East Providence, because that was the first establishment in 1643 with the Newman Church in the Ring of the Green, was where the Europeans first settled. And we think that's a significant area for people to learn about Sowams altogether. But this is Sagamore William Guy, who lives in Barrington and is the Pokanoket chief, if you will, for this area, and who does education with school groups and others. And I've been meeting and conversing with him to help get this whole thing off the ground. So, in conclusion, I'm at my 25-minute mark here. Sowams is the pivotal place of cultural exchange between indigenous people and the colonizing settlers of North America. That's a significant fact that needs to be widely known, okay? We all think it all happened in Plymouth. Well, we only know about Plymouth because since about 1915, they've done a good PR job. If we do a good PR job, people around the world will know about Sowams just as well, okay? Treaty, which we mentioned, the fact that the peaceful 50 years is unique, and that the toll of the eventual conflict was costless to both populations, but in particular to the Native American population. And we need to preserve and recognize the traces of our history so that we can understand and preserve them. So that's the story of the Sowams. Done my 25 minutes.
That's
We have 5
great.
minutes for
Great
questions.
job.
And I'd be glad to talk to people across the street. Sure.